Well, having grown up in the plains and the Rocky Mountain region, going to college on the West Coast, graduate school in Boston, in Chicago, and then here, it's interesting how as you go around the country, people are the same and yet people are all different, right? I know when you go to Boston, park your car in Harvard Yard. I figured out where all those R's went. All those R's in Boston drift up into the atmosphere and they float over into Texas and they drop down in Texas and Texans use them. But it's just kind of different, and those of you from the north know that things change when you pass over the Mason-Dixon line. Do they not? You pass over the Mason-Dixon line and the pace of life gets just a little bit slower. And the pickups, they get bigger. They get bigger. And the accents become a little more noticeable and particular and discernible. And Waffle Houses pop up everywhere. Man, when you get to Chattanooga, there they are. They just pop up everywhere. And of course, one of the other things that I really didn't mind, but it's kind of interesting, and I'm reminded of it every time I go back north, is that down south you have the choice of sweet or unsweet tea, right? You go up north, they don't give you sweet tea. And if you like sweet tea down here, what do they really give you? Southern tea. And that's like drinking pure syrup. Well, in thinking through all this stuff, it kind of made me think about how many times and how many things in life we try to alter or make them different than they really are. We try to lighten them, soften them, or sweeten them. How many things do you have to add to your car or have in your car or put on your car before it becomes a sweet ride? How many of you have bought bigger golf clubs and bigger tennis rackets to enlarge your sweet spot? Why, even I think our approach to church, religion, has become softened and sweetened. The power of possibility thinking, always to lift you up and make you feel great. Which is not wrong. It's just not the whole story. It's just not the whole story. And what it has done in many cases to the church and to the religion is that people come to this place, they come to us always, and I want to underline always, seeking comfort and assurance. Always. That's what they want. Make me feel better, which is not wrong, but sometimes, oftentimes, maybe even every time, the gospel should also challenge you. As a wise person once said, the gospel should comfort the comfortless and discomfort the comfortable. That there is an edge. That there can be no growth, there can be no spiritual maturation without resistance, without stress, without someone who says, you're standing here, but maybe you need to shift just a tad. Weightlifters know that if there's no resistance, there is no growth. How many people know the 23rd Psalm? Almost everybody. We like that one. But how many people can recite the Beatitudes? Everybody loves the pictures of the Jesus with the children all around him, but how many people really like the images and the story of the cross? You can't have one without the other. And this morning's scripture gives us the other Jesus. The Jesus who confronts the values, the beliefs, the traditions, the religious thought, the theology of the time. What initially caught my attention when I read the story, again, as I said, when I look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke put the cleansing of the temple story at the end of the Jesus narrative. If you read those Gospels, Jesus cleanses the temple on the Monday following Palm Sunday before he is crucified. Those Gospels say it's the only time he went to Jerusalem. He did this, and they killed him. It's as though the Gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were writing this wonderful symphony, and they were bringing all the instruments and the voices together for a climax, an exclamation point that goes bam! The cleansing of the temple sets the stage. But in John, rather than being at the end of the gospel, John puts it as the second thing Jesus does. It's way at the beginning of his gospel. And I began to think about that. Why would John reverse the order? You know, John has Jesus going to Jerusalem 3 times, not just once, and he cleanses the temple at the beginning. There's a purpose behind it. There's a message that John is trying to give to his listeners and his readers with his gospel. And I thought about that. John was a confrontative Jesus. He confronts the temple practices. He confronts the values and the lifestyle of the Samaritan woman at the well. He confronts Nicodemus and his theology and his thinking and his practice in the middle of the night. John's Jesus is one who stands toe-to-toe and face-to-face with us. Our thinking, our values, how we get from A to Z, and challenges us and says there's still a way to go. What was going on here? Well, the temple priests were not doing anything against the law. They weren't doing anything wrong. It was a common practice to make a sacrifice at the temple. Thousands of animals would have been sacrificed. The smoke and the stench actually would have been probably pretty profound. And of course, if you went there, you bought your sacrificial animal from the temple. It's already sounding like a good business proposition, is it not? If you had a pigeon or a sheep, a lamb, or a cow, you bought it from the temple. The temple owned them. In fact, they say that 90% of the sheep in the hills were owned by the temple. And the shepherds were just caretakers. But when you came there, and people would come to Passover from all over the world, from Syria, they came from Damascus, they would have come from Alexandria, they would have come from Antioch, they would have come from everywhere, they would have brought with them currency from those lands. Just like you would use Roman currency in other places. Well, when you got to the temple, that currency was no good. You had to have shekels. You had to have temple currency. And so, the issue here, and everybody say, I can't tell you, every church I served said, well, you know what, you shouldn't be selling bingo tickets out there because that's the money exchangers. That's not what it is at all. It's all about the usury. It's all about the fees that were being charged above and beyond that became an affront. When you have this Jesus who is concerned about the poor and the widowed and the hungry and the childless and the children and all these things, then he goes there and sees these people having to do this, so you got it all wrong. You got it all wrong. In fact, it was so lucrative that if you worked for the temple, if you participated in the sacrifices that daily took place there, priests only worked 1 day a year or 2 days a year and got paid for the full year. I want that job. And you couldn't just get it. The high priests, they were appointed. It was a family deal, and they were appointed by the Romans. They worked closely with the Romans. So you have this whole religious, theological, economic, social, political stuff all rolled together. And Jesus confronts it and says, something's not right here. He confronts the truth with his actions and his words, even though other people let what they said was the truth just carry on. And of course, to do that, Matthew says from that point on, they said, he must die. You see, this confrontative Jesus is willing to risk everything. This confrontative Jesus is so about us being accepted and loved as God's children, that all people should be equal in God's eyes, that there's a way to treat and there's not a way to treat, and there's a way to live. And this gospel that we preach about so superficially live, Jesus says, is worth my life. It's worth it all. He knew exactly what the consequences of his actions would be. And yet he did it. You know, I watched the news this week of the federal investigation in Ferguson, Missouri, of the situation out there. And, you know, in the course of that, the federal system released emails that were sent by government employees, which were quite offensive, and some of them made me quite sick. But what I wasn't shocked by that, I guess, but what really caused dismay is I wonder how many people were aware of that, knew that, received those, saw those, and didn't say anything before. I mean, how does this go on and on and on? Don't cause waves. Might cost me my job. And yet, like Peter, we say, I don't know him. Matthew records Jesus telling his disciples, I send you out as sheep among wolves. My truth, Jesus says, will cause division. Cause division among families. It will cause separation between you and people you thought were your friends. But he concludes by saying, but be strong. Be strong. Because those who endure will be saved. My father wanted me to be a professional golfer. I failed. He was a preacher, though, so he probably got, I don't know. He told me not to go into the business, so I'm not sure how he felt about that. Anyway, we would golf. That was time I spent with my dad. That was bonding time. We would golf, and the two of us would always be matched up with two others, right? That's how they do it. You get a foursome out there. You got two others, and we'd be playing, and these other people would be moving on. And, you know, I have a theory that next to church, God's name is used most on a golf course. And it was my experience that was the occurrence and that what was happening. And about the sixth or seventh hole, they would always ask, you know, you get around to, what do you do for a living? Well, I have learned over the years as a minister, especially on airplanes where you're confined, if people ask you what you do for a living, unless you really want a 2-hour conversation, you just say, I'm a consultant, which isn't a lie, because I do that. And they say, what do you consult about? I say, a lot of things. But my dad would say, well, I'm a clergyman. And that's when their game really got bad. And they would, at the end of the 9 holes, they would say to us, well, you know, we never wanted to play 18, da-da-da-da-da, so and so and so. And they would leave us, and we'd finish the 18 by ourselves. But almost always, we would see them on the course playing with somebody else at another hole. So I learned at a very, very early age that there is a price to pay. There is a cost to bear if you are going to be a witness. That when Jesus says, pick up your cross, it is not, well, you know, my bad hip is my cross to bear. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about those untruths, those injustices, those wrongs out there that just keep going until someone confronts them with God's truth. You know, we think oftentimes that these are dangerous and tenuous times. The 80s in Colorado were very dangerous and very tenuous. The banking crisis caused a lot of distress among farmers. Farmers who had had the farms in their families for generations were losing them. and there was a lot of anger and hostility, and the Aryan nations, who have a headquarters just north of Fort Collins, were taking advantage of that, and there was a lot of turmoil and just hostility and anger. Alan Berg, a radio talk show person who happened to be Jewish, was gunned down leaving the radio station. We had local newspapers who said that any child who had AIDS should have a tattoo on their forehead, so everyone should be aware of it. And Matthew Berg, the young student at the University of Wyoming, was hung on a barbed wire fence and crucified because he was gay. Tough times. And our church tried to pastor and minister to the farmers and do all that they could. And of course, you're supposed to continue to preach love and acceptance and community and what you really believe this is all about, which is pretty hard to do when every Sunday before worship the phone rang and it was someone calling the church to threaten your life. There is a cost to pay. The crosses we wear, the tattoos we bear, are not cosmetic jewelry. They stand for something. When we see the cross, it is horrific when you think about it. It is not something Jesus took lightly, but accepted willingly. When we bear that cross, when we wear that cross, we raise it up in a manner that says we wish to be a witness too. No matter what it takes, no matter what it demands. That Christ was willing to not only speak and act, but die for greater truth and justice, humanity's wholeness, salvation's way. There is a price. Or as Sir Isaac Watts wrote in that immortal hymn that is in your hymnal, when he thought about the cross, he penned these words: "Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all." And so the cross asks us, which will it be? Sweet or unsweet? Amen.